Hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lawrence Kelly. I'm the Vice President for Science Administration here at the New York Botanical Garden. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 4th Annual New York City Ecoflora Conference. At any time during today's event, you are welcome to submit questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your window, and we'll gather these for our speakers to answer at the end of the presentation. Live captions can be enabled by clicking the CC button with Show Subtitles or View Full Transcript. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available in the NYBG Lecture Library. The theme of this year's Eco Conference is Wetland Research and Conservation in New York City. I'll introduce our speakers and their presentations in just a couple of minutes, but first I'd like to summarize the key elements of the New York City Ecoflora for those of you who don't know about the project, and I'd like to also tell you how you can get involved with it. The New York Botanical Garden created the New York City Ecoflora in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Building on the garden's historical strengths in collections with emerging opportunities in digital technology, the Ecoflora is a community science project to document the wild flora of New York City. To date, nearly 25,000 observers have made more than 670,000 observations of plants and their biotic relationships. Each month, we sponsor an EcoQuest challenge, encouraging New Yorkers to observe a particular species or a genus and their ecological partners, and then post them on iNaturalist. We're posting to the chat now a link to the project site, at which you'll note that our current month's EcoQuest challenge is Seek Seaside Goldenrod, a coastal and wetland species chosen to coincide with this year's conference theme. If you'd like to sign up to get EcoQuest challenges sent to your email address, we're putting a link in the chat where you may do so. Recognizing initial successes of the project in New York City, in 2018, the Institute of Museum and Library Services awarded another grant to the New York Botanical Garden in partnership with 4 other botanical gardens to scale up and expand out the Ecoflora model nationally. Today, Ecoflora projects are flourishing at Denver Botanic Gardens, Chicago Botanic Garden, Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, and Marie Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, Florida. We're deeply grateful to the Institute of Museum and Library Services providing funding to enable these community science projects at all 5 of these public gardens. Finally, we are hugely thankful to the thousands of community scientists who make original observations of plants and their biotic partners through these Ecoflora projects. Urban biodiversity needs the documentation and conservation these dedicated naturalists enable. Now to today's 3 speakers. First, Dr. Aram Calhoun will present the keynote address entitled Conserving Wetlands in Human-Dominated Landscapes Through Local and Collaborative Approaches. Then, Rebecca Swadek and Marit Larson will co-present a talk entitled Wetlands Management Framework for New York City. Following the presentations, there will be a time for Q&A and discussion. If you have a question, please write it in the chat box, and these will be asked of the speakers during the conclusion after their presentations. Aram Calhoun, our first speaker, is a professor emerita of wetland ecology in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology at the University of Maine. Her research centers on conservation of wetlands with a focus on vernal pool ecosystems. She is particularly interested in conservation of natural resources on private lands and collaborative approaches to conserving wetlands through locally driven initiatives. Dr. Calhoun is active in working at all levels of government on wetland policy and conservation issues. Now we'll hear Dr. Calhoun present her talk, Conserving Wetlands in Human-Dominated Landscapes Through Local Collaborative Approaches. Aram, I pass it over to you.
I will unmute and share. And thank you all for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to learn about your project in New York. And even though I'm not a plant-centric talk, by conserving wetland ecosystems, we also conserve the plants that are in them. So I appreciate being able to come and speak with you people. So what I'd like to do is highlight that I'm talking about vernal pools as model ecosystems. So although I'm talking about one wetland type, the theory and the implementation of management projects is relevant to any sort of wetland ecosystem, particularly in landscapes where there's a lot of private land ownership. And also I'd like to highlight that when we conserve vernal pools plus the forests surrounding them, we connect landscapes for all wildlife, including plants, and we allow for traveling among ecosystems, especially in these times of changing climate. So I'd like to structure the talk today because I realize that not everyone is horribly familiar with vernal pools or in love with them the way that I am. So I'm going to give you a brief definition of them. I want to talk a little bit about the science that my lab has conducted over the last 25 years, and note right here that all of the work that you see here is the result of scores of graduate students and colleagues, not just my work. And I would like to talk a little bit about how our science has informed some of the management strategies that we've come up with, discuss some of the challenges, and more happily discuss a way forward in the face of these challenges. So as you can see from this vernal pool and others, they're the one wetland ecosystem that is not named or defined by the plant communities. They can be in all different kinds of wetlands. So the key factor that makes a vernal pool special and a target of special conservation is the fact that these pools are ephemeral. And that is, they fill in the winter with snow melt and rains. And by summer's end, most pools dry completely or they dry down significantly. And this creates the environment of a fishless environment like this, like you see here. So the other important factor being, whoops, hang on, I can't seem to move my, not being able to go forward. Any suggestions? There we go. Okay. That they don't have predatory animals such as bullfrogs and green frogs breeding in them. So this is a very specialized environment for a suite of breeding amphibians that cannot tolerate fish or larvae of these other species. So these dynamic wetland ecosystems in our state, and actually yours as well, are ephemeral. They're also relatively small. They have no permanent inlets or outlets. They may have temporary ones, and this keeps them fishless, and no breeding fish, green frogs, or bullfrogs. So in Maine, a couple species are obligate to vernal pools, and that includes the fairy shrimp, which is a very charismatic crustacean that has a life cycle of only 6 weeks. And we have one plant that's an obligate wetland species, Potonia inflata, which meets its northern limit in Maine, and hence it's fairly vulnerable because of that. It only occurs in 4 towns in southern Maine. We also have another special invertebrate, the ringed bog hunter, which breeds in muddy, mossy vernal pools. So they're not only just specialized breeding habitat for some more common amphibians, but they host some rare species. And they're also important for some rare turtles in Maine, blandings and spotted turtles, who use them all summer long as part of their habitat. But what we're going to do right now is meet the creatures that depend on these pools for successful reproduction. And the first is the wood frog, the most northerly ranging species of amphibian that we have, and a very tough Maine citizen, as you'll see as we go on. And the mole salamanders, mole because they spend their life in small shrew burrows or other small mammal burrows. There's the spotted salamander and the blue spotted complex. I wish I had time to go into the ecology of these amazing creatures, but the focus today is to talk about wetland management. So I'm just introducing you to the players here. So at the end of the winter, and this is a vernal pool close to my house that I keep track of, here is the snow melt and the snow, that's going to create the water for this pool. You can see it's melting down now. And as it's melting down, our creatures who winter under the snowpack, the salamanders and the wood frogs, have a mass migration the first rainy spring evening to the vernal pools. And we call that big night here because it's a big event. It harkens in spring. And this is just the catch from one pitfall bucket, like a 5-gallon bucket, around a vernal pool. So you can see one mass migration. You see all 3 species are in here. This is how we caught them to put radio transmitters and such on them. So the salamanders go under the ice and start their breeding season. They're trying to beat pools drying out, so they get an early jump, lay their eggs. Pool is completely open when the wood frogs come in. The males sing contagiously and attract all the females. They lay their eggs, and that's all that I can talk about right now about the breeding season. I can tell you that my graduate students have studied what goes on in the vernal pool, so much so that we have definitely enough information on how we need to manage these. So the focus of the lab in the last decade or so has been to look at the post-breeding habitat of the adults. So spotted salamanders and wood frogs leaving and going to the vernal pool to forested habitat. Wood frogs and blue spotted salamanders using an even different kind of summer habitat, a forested wetland. So we have upland forest, wetland forest, and then looking at juvenile dispersal, the animals responsible for moving the gene pool from one pool to a distant pool. So the way that we did this is we had those pitfall traps. We put radio transmitters on our wood frogs and followed them around the landscape. So we have studied frogs in the wild, but we decided we need to do some work with suburban frogs so that we could help landowners know what they could do to help conserve vernal pool amphibians and vernal pool scapes. Each color is a different animal, and all the dots are places where they were picked up by the graduate student spending time. So we did this for 2 years to get an idea of what animals in the vernal pool, which is down on your bottom right, you can see where all of the lines are emanating from. And they're headed to the northeast there, where there is an intact forested wetland in an otherwise fairly developed landscape. And then there's a frog off to the left with its own mind, but going to an intact piece of forest. We also studied these animals through the fall and into winter to get an idea of the post-breeding habitat for hibernation. And you can see, if you look in the middle of this, that there's a frog snuggled down into a shallow depression. There's a nickel next to that frog. There's just a little leaf litter over them, and they overwinter right under the snow, which is fairly important. They're fairly shallow, and this is why I'm calling them one of the toughest mainers here. Imagine doing that. We ski over wood frogs all the time. So the graduate student followed wood frogs through the winter, looked at differences between hibernation habitat and non-hibernation habitat so that we could learn a little about the management of winter habitat. We did the same thing for blue spotted salamanders in developing landscapes. Now, from New York's perspective, you may not think this is a developing landscape. From a Maine perspective, it is. So those years of work, we felt like we had enough information to move forward on developing management guidelines. Of course, you can always use more, but if you wait too long, then it's too late. So we decided to go ahead all through this time period with science-informed management recommendations. So just to recap, the things that we learned is that we call them vernal pool amphibians, but they're all different in terms of their post-breeding habitat needs and even the breeding pools that they use. There's summer habitat and winter habitat. There's differences in habitat that adults use versus juveniles. So suddenly you have a very complex picture, and it made us think, my goodness, if we can come up with management regulations for vernal pools, a very difficult wetland because it's pool plus forest, then we should be able to solve some other wetland problems or challenges. So the other thing that we learned is recorded distances for the adults. We know that the juveniles go miles and miles from breeding pools. The adults are moving up to a mile. Spotted salamander only recorded was 817 feet, but keep in mind that our radio transmitters have limited life. We have to change them a couple times. So we never could really follow an animal through its entire life history, because we had a rule of not putting transmitters on more than twice for the safety of the animals. So These are conservative travel distances from the breeding pool into the surrounding habitat. I'm enjoying the Bringing Nature Home book by Doug Ptolemy, and it made me think that, well, this is what we're trying to do, have the landowner bringing nature home. We did learn that our suburban frogs need cover, hedgerows, some sort of vegetation to get them to the open forest, lawn chemicals, lawn mowers, pets, sewer drains. These are all great hazards to these species. And I do want to point out that some of these vernal pool species are locally extirpated in parts of the Midwest because of this sort of development and agricultural development. So it is something that we need to keep track of. Hibernation sites, they seem to return to the same hibernation sites just as the majority of the population returns to the same breeding pools. So it's not so easy to just say, oh, well, we'll move them. The other thing is that other wetlands and vernal pools are very important, especially to migrating juveniles, but even to migrating adults. So we need an intact landscape with intact wetlands. Some of the other things that we learned is that there's very high road mortality. I don't know why age makes a difference, but when you look at a salamander and you realize that they live to the age of your college students, 15 to 20, 21 years, it makes you think twice about running them over. So we have high road mortality. During COVID, a student did a project and showed that mortality rates were much reduced by 50% with COVID. We've got salt problems, we've got chemical problems, we have issues with amphibians having higher incidences of diseases from urban pools. And one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is with increasing climate change in Maine, we have very, very cold temperatures in the winter, and we used to have thick snowpack. And this insulated frogs to 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which they do not want to thaw beyond. Wood frogs freeze most of their body. They have a special glycogen antifreeze, but they can only freeze and thaw a couple of times in the beginning of the winter. We're getting these thaws when we've got these animals coming out in February, and they cannot refreeze. So we're getting wood frog mortality in the winter, and we're getting spotted salamanders who hibernate in shrew burrows so they don't freeze. We're getting them coming out early, then winter comes back and they freeze. So I'm almost as concerned about post-breeding habitat for the survival of these species as I am about their disappearing breeding pools. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the current regulatory environment for vernal pools and how it is that my lab switched to trying to do a workaround. The federal regulations, and you may know that we've had a lot of different presidents with different ideas about conservation. And so the Clean Water Act regulation on vernal pools has been greatly weakened. There's a federal area of concern, they don't even want to call it of regulation, around vernal pools, and that has become weakened over time. The state regulation in the state of Maine, we did manage to get regulations put on the books in 2007. We have a permit zone of 250 feet for a subset of vernal pools. So the problem is that in the state, also because of politics, pool significance is based on egg mass numbers, and that ends up conserving less than 20% of all pools have some sort of regulation in Maine. So although regulations are great, they put vernal pools on the map, they make people think about them more, there are a lot of gaps, both at the federal and state level. I come from southern New England, and I've seen vernal pools disappear, or at least vibrant vernal pools with breeding populations disappear, and I wanted to prevent that from happening in Maine. Among the challenges is people's perceptions that there are muck holes and mosquito-driven ecosystems. Other challenges are that they're hard to inventory, remote sensing, there's no statewide inventory of vernal pools. It's a wetland that requires conservation of the pool plus the surrounding forest because the animals dependent on them are biphasic and they have an upland life phase as well. The majority are on private property, and there are many gaps in the regulation. So this is another issue that we have. I love this expression because it reminds me of the post office. One landowner was quoted as saying, if this goes vernal pool, it's now a verb, if it goes vernal pool, it could cut me out of a house lot. So people perceived the 2007 regulation as a no build zone, even though they could still get permits. And suddenly it became a big issue of vernal pools on private land, even though not a single project was stopped with vernal pools. But reason isn't always the thing. So the problem also is that the amphibians have no regard for the law. And as you recall from the distances, they go way beyond the 250-foot regulatory zone. And in that zone, you can also develop. So this was a problem for us. The other problem is that the federal government calls vernal pools and other ephemeral wetlands, prairie potholes, California vernal pools, isolated wetlands. And we've worked hard to get that term removed. There is no way that they are isolated. A working group that I was involved in produced a lot of research and papers on how vernal pools are biogeochemically, hydrologically, and biologically connected to the surrounding landscape. So part of the problem is that they have a bad name, isolated wetlands. Who wants to conserve isolated wetlands? If you're not enamored of the cuteness of the vernal pool amphibians, we were thinking about, well, how else can we reach the general public? And one of the things that's popped up in Maine is the value of vernal pools for other wildlife. People, I was amazed to find out, think amphibians are slimy and disgusting to touch. So we went a different route, and you can see the highlighted in yellow section. Those are things that people can hunt. And it turns out that vernal pools are very important little oases in upland areas for supporting a whole range of signature wildlife in Maine and other species as well. There is very high production of egg masses, even in years when we lose the egg masses to drought. There's a lot of protein in vernal pools. And we had a graduate student who had camera traps in vernal pools, and I'm just going to show you a few photos of the fast food oasis or dining in. Ducks visit in the spring to get those egg masses. Bears come towards the end of the summer because it's still a damp habitat with a lot of good vegetation. We have deer, red fox. This is a fisher visiting a pool in the winter. And the most amazing thing this year is we have seen barred owls taking an individual spotted salamander out of a vernal pool. So a lot of support for raptors, bobcat, and great blue herons. There's also, for those who don't like to dine in, there's fast food takeout. There's a tremendous amount of biomass going into the surrounding forest. Many of our radio transmitters end up beeping in hawks, in garter snakes and other snakes who prey on these things as they leave the pools. And they like both flavors of salamanders and wood frogs. So our goal was, we've done a lot of education and trying to bring the public around to seeing pools as unisolated, integral parts of New England forests, because we are afraid that without that, pools will be inundated with houses and no travel routes for the amphibians. So the whole goal was, how do we make these two things work together? We started in 2011 with community scientists mapping and assessing all the vernal pools in all of these towns. And we left each town with a digital map of all of their potential vernal pools and their state regulated significant vernal pools. However, the maps sat into the towns with no proactive work because towns are very busy, and they got hauled out when the planning board had a potential housing project going up or something like that. And we thought, well, we need something more proactive to happen. We've tried traditional top-down regulation, And that doesn't work. That just creates animosity. And I can actually understand why the federal regulation is different than the state regulation. It's very frustrating for landowners. Voluntary approaches worked very well for our forest community, but did not work well with the development community because you've got a lot of money involved there. So we developed a new approach that is locally driven, based on the best available science, co-produced management, which means that we actually assembled a group of stakeholders, found a common problem that none of us liked the current regulatory environment, and worked on it with them instead of just telling people what to do, what we had decided through the best available science. We now compensate landowners, we provide predictability and flexibility to developers, and we complement our existing regulations, so we work within that framework. So what we did is we developed a special area management plan, and it's called the Vernal Pool SAMP. A special area management plan is an available tool in the Army Corps of Engineers toolkit. It's a plan managing sensitive natural areas. There are some of these in New England related to coastal wetlands. Considers economics. It includes policies and mechanisms for implementation. So we decided to develop one of these for vernal pools. We got a 25-person regular attendee group together of stakeholders. It took us 7 years to write the management plan and over 100 meetings, because it takes that when you're working with diverse stakeholders. We included 3 federal agencies, 5 state agencies, 2 towns from our community scientists worked, Orono and Topsom, because they were progressive and responsive, economists, developers, land trusts, ecologists, planning consultants, and interested citizens. And I have highlighted in orange people that we don't, at least in my work, we don't, as biologists or ecologists, bring to the table to discuss these things. The reason it took 7 years is we all came with different jargon, different missions, different language, and it just took us that long to get to know each other and to co-produce a plan. If you're interested in the social science aspect of this, and I'm not a social scientist, but I became one out of necessity, we have that in a paper called Turning Contention into Collaboration. And it's an interesting case study in how we made this work. So we have been working with 2 town leaders to get it implemented. We developed the SAMP, but now we need to implement it, Orono and Topsom. This alternative mitigation tool has been accepted by the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's available to all New England states. So we're hoping that it spreads once Maine can be a model for this. I've given talks to folks in Michigan and other parts of the country who are interested in coming up with a similar tool. Community outcomes are certainty and predictability, compact development, because we focus development in growth areas, as I'll show you, supports our city visions for rural lands, provides money for perceived takings to our landowners, and it conserves pools in a landscape context, which conserves that connectivity that is relevant to all wetlands. So where we're going to focus now is we've gotten buy-in by the federal government and by the Maine DEP, which is our regulatory arm for natural resources. The towns have what we call partial delegated authority, and that means we have home rule in Maine. That means that a town can create stricter regulations than either the state or the feds. Partial delegated means that they want to just do vernal pools, not all wetlands. So where our work focuses is with the towns and implementing the SAMP. The SAMP is a town approved thing because all the citizens vote on accepting an ordinance that has this plan in it. So that is the first thing. It's voluntary. Everybody has signed on, all levels of government, including the town people in Topsom and in Orono. So these are the key players: the developers, a land trust or other nonprofit, and a rural landowner. And I'm going to show you how these all come together in the SAMP. the way that it works is in Maine, since we have home rule, we have comprehensive plans for organized towns. Every town is divided into a rural zone and a growth area. What the SAMP allows, if you look at those blue dots, those are the result of our community science mapping project. It allows a developer to enter the growth area, and without getting a permit from feds, the state, or anybody, they can impact a vernal pool. It's a carte blanche to do your development. In return, the developer gives money to the land trust, and the land trust conserves 2 vernal pools, an appropriate number of post-breeding habitat for the amphibians. So in other words, a developer can go in on the left, instead of putting a little buffer around that pool and building out around the pool, which makes it a great urban wetland, but not a functioning vernal pool ecosystem. We take money from the developer, run it through a land trust, and are able to remunerate willing landowners to put conservation easements on pools plus forest. And we can use multiple landowners and contiguous towns. So what we've discovered trying to implement this is that, as you might imagine, towns and land trusts and rural communities are a whole different bunch of people to deal with. So when we tried to implement this, we ran into different problems with different people. The town of Orono was having trouble getting landowners to want to do an in perpetuity conservation easement. So they asked us to develop a landowner communication plan. And I think here, my major point is that we knew that we were going to have issues implementing, but the more that we got into the actual on the ground plan, the more problems we ran into and the more work we have to do. So we're continuing to do research on this. We're working on a landowner communication plan in Orono. And then we found that land trusts have their hands tied. Some are voluntary, some are paid. So the landowner and the land trust is key to the success of this implementation. So we need to work with land trusts as well. And we found that we've had to backtrack, and maybe you folks have more experience with this, but in perpetuity conservation easements are terrifying to landowners. And I know that the land trust leaders in the state of Maine are working on some conservation models that are shorter term. And maybe it's a 10-year commitment or a 50-year commitment. And we're very interested into looking into that, because we feel if landowners are not afraid of conservation easements anymore, maybe in the future, they would say, this wasn't so bad. I think I'm going to do a regular conservation easement that's in perpetuity. And frankly, we don't have the time to wait. It could be another 20 years to get our landowners comfortable with in perpetuity, and we don't have that time. So I'm looking for anybody's guidance or experience with helping us to work with landowners. We started working with service providers. We have a thing called Putting Your Land in Tree Growth in Maine, and a lot of people have foresters who work closely with them. So we're working with them to discuss vernal pools. So what's interesting to me is that it was a 7-year project to get the SAMP made. And then we got 2 towns to actually go through the process of getting partial delegated authority. And now my colleagues and I are back into the trenches, having to restart research on how we get the land trusts and the rural landowners to be able to implement this process smoothly. We are working on a project right now with developers, and they're running into trouble with the lack of flexibility by our federal and state partners. So that's something else that we have to work on. People are not comfortable with such a flexible tool. So I guess the good news is that I will never run out of work, but we have a lot of optimism in moving forward with this. One of the things that we've done in concert with the research all through the decades has to work on outreach and education. So while we were doing the biophysical research, we had the community science program going. From that, we developed a manual on how community science folks can map and assess vernal pools. We've kept a web page going, and we have that web page updated so that it's going to be focusing on the SAMP. It includes a manual for municipal landowners on how to use the SAMP, PowerPoint programs, and lots of support, so that once we get these good models and examples going, any town in Maine has a cookbook on how they go forward with the SAMP. And I'm hoping that this spreads to other New England states. There have been inquiries about this. We have all of the issues from state to state, and New York and other northeastern states of different forms of government, but that can all be worked out. One of the things that we've worked on, we noticed that we have a Farmland Trust, and they help farmers keep their land with conservation easements to keep it in farming. But a lot of private landowners really appreciate some acknowledgement. So we developed a vernal pool plaque that landowners can get from their local nonprofits, which acknowledge that their land is conserving vernal pool wildlife. So this is our webpage of Pools and People. There's information there on the research that we've done. We've posted some major research papers, and we have a tab for kids, and we have the webpage on the SAMP for how to go about doing that. And we have a community science tab as well. So I'm happy to be done now, only because I was hoping we'd have lots of time for productive questions at the end of this. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. And I'm also really looking forward to input, because there are no blanket answers. And I expect that a lot of folks in the audience and from the New York Botanical Garden might have some advice for us as well. And with that, I will stop sharing and open it back up to you. And I'll turn off my microphone.
Thank you, Dr. Calhoun, for that excellent presentation. There's lots of really great insights on community engagement approaches to management and conservation of wetlands and human-dominated landscapes. And yes, you're correct. We'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end, and we look forward to lots of questions and discussion. Next, we'll turn our focus to wetlands of one of the particularly well-known human-dominated landscapes. We're talking about New York City. And our guides for this will be Rebecca Swadek and Marit Larson. Rebecca Swadek is the Senior Program Manager for Wetlands Restoration at New York City Parks, where she oversees an interdisciplinary team focused on protecting and managing the streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands on New York City's parkland. Trained as a botanist, Rebecca has over 12 years experience ranging from plant taxonomy to ecological restoration, green roofs, and land management in Texas, California, and New York. Rebecca holds a master's degree in environmental science from Texas Christian University and a bachelor's degree in biology from Texas A&M. Marit Larson is the chief of natural resources for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. She oversees the protection, restoration, and management and conservation of New York City's parks 10,000 acres of natural spaces. She's responsible for forest and wetlands restoration, conservation research, and stormwater green infrastructure design and construction, as well as for New York City's Native Plant Center and its Urban Field Station, a collaboration with the United States Forest Service. Over her career, Marit has worked on urban wetland and stream restoration projects and watershed plans in the US and in Germany and Australia. She holds master's degrees in environmental engineering and is in natural resource management from the University of Washington and from the University of California at Berkeley. Rebecca and Marit will now speak about wetlands management framework for New York City. I turn it over to the speakers.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I coming through? Great, thanks. And Rebecca, this is Marit Larson, and thanks for that introduction. And Rebecca is going to help me with the slides, and I'll start us off, and she'll close us out. So first, I just want to thank you so much for having us today. It's a real honor to be part of the Ecoflora conference. We've been able to participate via our esteemed plant ecologists in the last years, Clara Holmes, who's focused really deeply in the field of our rare and threatened and endangered species and management. And so Becca and I will be bringing it up to a higher level, talking about our management across the landscape. And I just want to thank the first speaker so much. It's a fascinating presentation, really inspiring. And it makes me a little relieved that I was starting with some of the first slides as we transition to the New York City. So to kick us off, I'm going to start with this rendering of New York prior to the European colonization and development from Eric Sanderson's book Mannahatta. It's a kind of a way to inspire us to envision what has been the diversity and ecological resources that once prevailed across this landscape, and try to draw on some of the diversity and the foundations of what was here as we protect what remains, and try to restore and manage it as well as we can for posterity. So it's easy to imagine, I think, this as Manhattan, but as we move to through this talk, or we're going to start with some more green to get you sort of oriented towards the resources that still remain that we're really attending to. So I'll go through kind of a visual tour of the diverse wetlands that we're trying to protect. And we're going to start with one of our larger marsh systems, which is at Sawmill Creek in the northwest corner of Staten Island. So we have a significant amount to us of large salt marsh systems remaining that actually host a diversity of species. We've got, in fact, over 100 rare and threatened species across New York City that still depend in some form on wetlands in their life cycle. So as we move then across the waterfront of New York, we also have a large number of small fringe salt marshes. So these can be as narrow as 10, 20 feet in width, and they're more scattered across our urban landscape here in the Pugsley Creek in the Bronx. And it sort of gives you an indication of the challenges we have in both our larger preserves and across more diverse, smaller areas where people actually access and are more able to experience the wetlands. So these are two tidal wetlands that I've focused on. Now moving up into the landscape, we've got freshwater wetlands that have even more diversity in their character and size than our salt marshes. Here in Staten Island, an example of an open water freshwater wetland in a forested park. We've got some other the diverse wetlands that include emergent species like this, also in Staten Island. This is Peltandra dominated emergent marsh at a site actually that we've been working on protecting because it's a large area. The area has been converted to a stormwater wetland, and we've had to work to preserve these plants. We've also got numerous shrub and forested wetlands. So this is an example. The next one here is an example again in Staten Island in the southwest corner the northwest corner, it's our Staten Island Industrial Park, a real hidden location. And then here's an example, the next one, of a forested wetland in Van Cortlandt Park, one of our most popular parks in the Bronx, but still quite hidden. And here's where we also have numerous vernal pools that are probably not as many salamanders as we heard about in Maine, but are still really important for the same reasons, supporting dusky salamanders, spotted salamanders, and participating in the food chain that they support. So forested wetlands, we've also got some examples of swamp forest, hard red maple wetlands. Again, this is an example in Staten Island and Last Chance Pond, and our riparian forest systems that we also see in along numerous remaining creeks. And here's, again, examples in Staten Island, and another example that follows in the Bronx in our Rattlesnake Creek. So we've got these important green spaces that host the diversity of wetland plants and species. That's pretty surprising still in New York, dozens. Over 50 rare, threatened, and endangered species that still are found across these systems. And if we look up to the landscape, the slide, the green I want to end on in this rapid tour is of constructed systems. We'll talk a little bit about this marsh and wetland restoration that we do in the city, but green infrastructure, the management of stormwater up in the landscape to try to recreate the processes that are lost during development is an important component of what we do and think about. And I'll just highlight a photo on the bottom right is of a rain garden at our Native Plant Center in Staten Island, an important piece of our conservation work that we won't highlight here, but it's that has helped us be able to work on wetland restoration and protection by virtue of collecting and conserving wetland seed species. So next, I'm going to kind of zoom way back up and kind of emphasize again that although we're in New York City with a very large portion of the land surface built, we've still got a substantial green left. We've got about 30% of our landscapes that are still green, support a diversity of vegetation, about 12% that are actually still natural. And these numbers come from our partner, the Natural Areas Conservancy, and the landscape analysis they did in 2014 to come up with an ecological cover type map for New York City that to help us assess the range of vegetation cover types across the city. So of those natural areas, over 10,000 acres are forest, nearly 5,000 acres are grassland. Some of the grassland is newly constructed, as you might guess, in landfills that are converted to natural systems. And then over 6,000 acres are wetlands. And so despite that kind of positive view of what's left in the city, obviously we've lost a huge amount. Our historic wetlands really belonged with, the island city that we are. The map here originally prepared by the Regional Plan Authority shows just, I think, in dramatic effect how much wetland we used to have around the Jamaica Bay area and in Staten Island in particular. So we've lost more than 80% of our salt marshes, our tidal wetlands. We've also lost the vast majority of our streams, much of that in our most developed areas, so Manhattan in particular. And the hardest hit of our wetlands has been our freshwater systems in the landscape. So with that, I want to emphasize what we are managing in parks. In the parkland system alone, in New York City parks, we've got over 1,500 acres of tidal marshes, and those are all, for the most part, salt marshes. We've also got not quite as many, but about 800 acres of freshwater systems, including the examples I showed earlier of open water ponds, emergent wetlands, scrub shrubs, and forested wetlands. And what we've also paid particular attention to more recently is the extent to which we have streams, both historic streams remaining across our park system and new streams. So new channels caused by upstream development, but that still play an important role in conveying stormwater and therefore influence our freshwater and aquatic systems and the forests around them. So we've spent a lot of time in the last decades really attending to these systems, beginning in the 80s when our division in the natural resources group at Parks was founded, mapping these areas. Eventually, in 2000, developing a system of forever wild preserves that were intended to conserve both these wetlands and the forests surrounding them. And then in the aughts, in the 10 years, particularly after in the first 10 years of this millennia, increasingly doing restoration projects with partners, both from the city and in the city, nonprofit organizations, partners like the New York City Audubon and numerous community groups, as well as federal and state partners. And more recently, in the last 10 years, we've increasingly focused on assessing wetland condition, and with the support of, again, our partners at the Natural Areas Conservancy and the several grants from EPA, have been able to do a more in-depth assessment of these wetlands in particular. So what this has led to with kind of a culmination of, as I said, decades worth of attending to these natural systems is what we're here to talk about today, finally, our wetlands management framework. So moving on, the wetlands management framework is really this culmination of effort to develop management strategies and approaches that would really focus on the new threats that we're facing in the city as a result of climate change and increased development pressure. And what we're doing with that framework in the next slide, I'll pass it, is providing an overview of why wetlands are important, why they're at risk, what we've done in the past to protect them, sort of the history beginning with the Clean Water Act that's been critical to their survival. And what we're also moving towards is understanding really presenting an overview of the conditions and health of the wetland systems, and how we now need to move towards protecting and restoring them. So what we'll do in the rest of the talk here is provide kind of a high-level overview of what's in the management framework, and then ultimately what we need to do to try to achieve our goals. And these, first or foremost, are to really provide recognition of these systems across the city and communicate their importance both to the public in general, as well as to our partner agencies and how we view their protection as critical, and to decision makers and elected officials that are going to be critical for us to meet conservation and protection goals. So fundamentally, what we're most concerned about is preventing net loss of wetlands and creating, wherever possible, new wetlands to offset that loss. We're focused with this effort on the health of the wetlands that we do have, better managing them and protecting them from stormwater. And we're also focused on trying to identify and communicate about the connections between wetland types across the watershed. So from those more visible to some coastal tidal wetlands, and clarifying their connection to those upstream, isolated wetlands or not so isolated wetlands. So the goal then is fundamentally to make sure we've got the resources to restore and manage these systems, whether it's staff or through or capital projects. And then finally, to work with our partners to expand the protection of these systems through policies. The critical ecosystem services that wetlands provide, I think, were really well demonstrated in the first talk, and for many of our listeners probably familiar, but they're increasingly important as our wetlands are becoming more threatened. So from stormwater capture and resiliency in the face of increased stormwater from the coast, as well as increased intensity storms and the landscape side, the capacity of wetlands to absorb and contain these flood flows is critical. The water quality protection function is essential, and something that we're focused on with our partners at DEP in expanding their role in providing habitat and diversity of species is critical. As I mentioned, and Becca will talk about more, we've got dozens of rare and threatened endangered species that depend on these habitats for their life cycle. And then perhaps as importantly in New York City is the ability to utilize and access these spaces for recreation and mental health and appreciation and education. So despite these functions that wetlands are serving in New York City today, and despite important protections that have been in place for decades, we've still got ongoing threats. So the critical threats that we're trying to highlight in this framework are the fragmentation that still occurs with development, this impact of sea level rise, especially in coastal marshes, the the erosion and disruption in sediment supply that prevents these marshes from keeping up with sea level rise, or for building up. We've got acres of wetlands that we still lose every year along the coastline due to erosion. And then we've got some more challenges facing our systems due to stormwater runoff, debris and pollution, and eutrophication that contributes to added stress both in our freshwater systems and our streams and in our coastal systems. So these challenges are really important, we think, to address at a watershed scale and across the landscape. It's sometimes difficult for people to still conceive of our resources when they seem so isolated by development as being parts of watersheds, but they are critically so. And that's another element that we're trying to focus on in the watershed plan. So finally, moving on to the impact that regulations and protections provide. In the framework, we try to provide a timeline of the accomplishments in wetlands protection, including at the federal level, really critical work that prevented additional filling of the particular of coastal wetlands, and that have provided really important tools for us to be able to continue to assure that as our urban waterfront develops, that we've got tools for providing options for mitigation. And we have really robust protections for the coastal wetlands in particular. However, we've got numerous shortcomings with existing wetlands, in particular, the ability to regulate in the watershed and ensure that landscape development is done in a way to protect downstream systems. We've got outdated regulatory maps, something that we're working on improving. We've got really limited protections for small unmapped wetlands, vernal pools, as that's been mentioned in particular, and limits in being able to regulate, ensure that buffer areas around wetlands are protected. Finally, particularly on the coast, our regulations don't address ongoing sea level rise and the need for marshes to migrate. And we've got limited accountability in our wetlands mitigation. Although we can mitigate, we don't really have the kinds of assurances that the resulting projects will provide the same functions as the original wetlands. So I'll end with hopefully a positive note. We've really learned a lot in the last couple decades with partnering to construct wetlands restoration projects, stream and wetlands projects across the city in every borough. And we've created and enhanced hundreds of acres of salt marsh and freshwater wetland in the process, spending a significant amount of money. And what is most important for us to do now is to continue that in the future. I want to mention a few links that we'll send in the chat where you can actually look at where we've done restoration in the past across the Harbor Estuary Program, and at our partners, the Natural Areas Conservancy website, which happens to be just a little easier to navigate for some things than our New York City Parks website. We've got references that show some of the reports we've produced looking at wetlands restoration guidelines and monitoring guidelines over the last years. And that actually has a live map that where you can look at where the wetlands are across the city, their condition, and restoration opportunities. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Becca, and she's going to be talking about the rest of the kind of conditions and assessment work that we've done across the city to inform our management and protection recommendations. Becca?
Great, thanks so much. Starting in 2013, New York City Parks and the Natural Areas Conservancy, as Mart had mentioned, began an ecological assessment of our forests, salt marshes, freshwater wetlands, and streams. We assessed a representative area across all of these habitats and looked at specific metrics that we use to aim to inform condition of them. So across all of these habitats, we looked at native and invasive vegetation cover, and particularly thinking of development density. But in salt marshes, more specifically, we also looked at bird utilization. So if there were breeding obligate birds such as salt marsh sparrows or clapper rails and such, we considered that. And we also looked at the strength of the underlying peat. So if it was a non-degrading system, we would see higher strength values. If it was a degraded system, we would see lower values. In streams in particular, we also looked at floodplain connectivity and the number of stormwater outfalls entering each one of these systems. Some of what we found is that our healthiest salt marshes are comparable to those elsewhere in the mid-Atlantic. So some of those like salt marshes that Sawmill Creek in particular, which is great that we had an urban wetland that is more comparable to those that are in significantly much more rural environments. And that many of our wetlands, despite their condition and despite the significantly urban environment, do still provide ample habitat for rare and threatened and endangered species, though that habitat might be significantly more threatened. Approximately 71% of our wetlands are dominated by native species, which is great. So Spartina versus Phragmites, for example. But pretty much all of them are showing some evidence of degradation. In particular, citywide, we've lost 17% of our shoreline due to erosion. When we calculated, it was 1974 to about 2014, so across 40 years there. And that was different in some watersheds versus the other. The Long Island Sound, for example, was on the 30% range of that compared to some others in Staten Island. About 50% are showing indications of drowning or subsidence. So that kind of like hummock hollow topography that you might see at salt marshes that show indication that they're not getting the amount of oxygen that they need and they're becoming waterlogged. And all show some evidence of human disturbance, whether or not that is recent disturbance from more like filling and anthropogenic disturbance, or even historical agricultural use. All of our coastal marshes are very threatened by sea level rise, and as sea levels rise, pushing the tide level or the tide higher up into the upland, there's very little room for them to migrate inland, and that amount is certainly not offset by the pace of erosion that we're seeing. I'm sorry, I'll find my notes. In freshwater wetlands specifically, they also support rare wildlife such as dragonflies and frogs that are dependent on this aquatic habitat. Approximately 80% of forested and scrub shrub wetlands are dominated by native canopy, which is great. I can't say the same for the emergent wetlands, but almost all have some level of invasive species, with the exception of just a couple. Freshwater wetlands, also we knew, but we confirmed that hundreds are unregulated citywide by either state or federal regulations. For streams, we confirmed that out of approximately 250 to 300 historical stream miles, we have 40 of those that remaining. So that's about 16%. Of those 102 miles that are not historical, we mostly have about 72 miles of what are considered new streams. These are basically constructed streams to convey stormwater away from developed areas, or gullies, for example, formed as a result of development pressure, just locations where stormwater accumulated and cut through the landscape. Condition of our streams varies widely. As expected, though, the least developed streams or least developed watersheds often contain the nicest streams. So the Staten Island Greenbelt or parts of Van Cortlandt Park, for example, not surprisingly have some of our nicest stream systems. About 80% of our streams are significantly impacted by development and really don't provide suitable habitat for many fauna, or at least diverse fauna. And approximately 30 miles are small headwaters, and they do remain unprotected. So what does all of this information tell us? We basically use this data to learn things about our streams and wetlands, but we also needed to have this information inform how we care for them. So for each metric collected, we assigned it a category for health or threat. So for example, the presence of desirable flora or fauna indicates good health, while invasive presence may indicate a threat. We converted the health and threat matrix into an index score and plotted those scores across this matrix. So each dot basically represents the relative condition of a stream or a wetland. So high health and low threat in the top left corner, running from low health to high threat in the bottom right-hand corner. Each dot along this matrix can also be translated to inform what type of management action we need to help improve their condition. So for example, we would protect resources in good health with few threats, restore or reconstruct those with poor health and significant threats, and manage those that are in between. So intensity of management kind of goes along this axis. And the chosen strategy for each site or study area is really based on the resource type and the source of the problem contributing to the management need. So for example, if a wetland is not able to function, why is it not able to function and how can we correct that? We also acknowledge to some degree that this framework is a little bit simplified because as we, thinking from a watershed context, all of these wetlands are going to need protection that extends beyond our park boundaries. So when I say restore, manage, and protect, what type of actions am I really talking about? So for protection, there's many strategies that we can utilize to help care for our property. For one thing, we can help acquire property within the flood zone in particular. So anything that is wetland now, or as we heard from the first presentation, the surrounding buffer is also critical to help protect, particularly for wildlife that need additional space surrounding to move around. This is a strategy that obviously requires funding and that we are able to employ significantly less frequent, but it's definitely a critical one. We also monitor wetland health and habitat quality to identify threats. In salt marshes in particular, we have long-term monitoring sites with surface elevation tables that allow us to detect millimeter level scales and the changes in the elevation over time. These are critical to identify which of our marshes are drowning under sea level rise and need more immediate management, or which could potentially functioning in a better state. We also monitor rare plant communities and collect and bank seed for those. Where seeds are harder to collect, or for example, new plants were installed for restoration, we also work with crews and stewards to install fencing to deter herbivores. So in particular, geese in salt marshes and deer everywhere else. But most importantly, we have to engage communities early and often in any sort of management action we choose, whether or not it's protection or restoration. They're critical to understand the importance of natural areas and critical to engage stewards so they appreciate these spaces and are able to advocate for them moving forward. So iNaturalist is actually a really great way to engage communities in community science, and a tool that we use, but also work with the New York Botanical Garden to implement. So New York City has over 300 native species in our wetlands. Approximately 69 are rare, threatened, and endangered. And when I say wetland species, we categorize this between they're either obligate, always occurring in wetlands, facultative wetland, or facultative. So that's that breakdown. And then almost a third of New York's historical or extirpated species are actually found in wetlands, which equates to 14. These species are found from floodplains to salt marshes and include emergent species such as iris and tripsicum, or eastern gamagrass, which is one of my personal favorites, and then salt marsh species such as Symphyotricum subulatum that's found often on salt marsh edges, but it's increasingly kind of making inroads to disturbed roadsides along the coastline. They can also be forested or floodplain swamp forest species such as euonymus that are preferentially deer food, and Praxinus profunda, which are increasingly threatened by emerald ash borer. New York City has about 30,000 acres of parkland and just really a handful of people staffed to protect and manage these sites. So logging occurrences of species, rare or not so rare, in iNaturalist is critical. This has also allowed our scientists to use iNaturalist data combined with historical data help rank our flora by species occurrence and frequency of occurrence. I'll also add that most of those are wetland species, partially because of their restricted range. So if their habitat is pretty much restricted to wetlands, and they're also more vulnerable to climate change, that only increases their rarity long term. Some typical management actions, shifting a little bit more out of the protection realm into on the ground work that we do. We often work with crews and volunteers to do various tasks, such as removing floatable debris from wetlands and managing invasive species. Invasive species management occurs across scales. So from intensive contractor restoration to remove an entire floodplain that's not weed, for example, like this one, this is at Snug Harbor in along Harbor Brook in Staten Island, or versus a floodplain forest that might be dominated by trout lily in the spring, but has a significant amount of multiflora rose coming in at certain locations. So those we can do with a lower, lighter touch with stewards or crews. These are excellent activities that allow them to see a more immediate transformation in the landscape versus something that might take a longer restoration scale project that might take a little bit longer to see the success. We also try to connect habitats together, so increasing habitat connectivity through either eco passages such as you see here, or fish ladders, for example, which is one we have on the Bronx River that allows alewife to actually ford over a dam. Additionally, we use rain gardens to help capture, detain, and treat stormwater at its source and help protect our inland streams and wetlands from the heavy pollution and erosion that stormwater from typical storms can bring to them. Well-designed rain gardens can also provide increased connectivity at the landscape scale to the resources themselves. So they're critical kind of gateways often into natural areas. Well-designed ones can also provide really critical stopover habitat and nectar resources for pollinators. More intensive scale restoration actions are typically include things that are aimed at reconstructing something that was lost or is in a very active state of erosion or degradation. So as I mentioned, we've lost about 17% of our shoreline over the last 40 years, and a lot of our wetlands are also degrading in condition and drowning. So an example here is you can see the current shoreline in green, and you can see where the historical shoreline, there's a little bit of a terrace in kind of that peach color where it historically persisted. And so we're working on a couple of projects particularly in the Alley Creek watershed, where we're trying to reconstruct a shoreline and place clean sand or as a planting medium to allow the wetland to reach the elevations that it needs to be appropriate for plant survival. Similarly, we can translate this technique to the interior of the marsh to reduce drowning and help preserve habitat for salt marsh sparrows or obligate ground nesting birds. In areas that are typically flooded by hurricanes and such, or larger coastal storms that are filled, where we can also remove historical fill to reach the tidal elevations that are required to support these species and restore marsh as well. The opportunities for this, though, are becoming significantly more limited, as this is kind of our bread and butter project that we've done for the past decades, and there are fewer and far between opportunities to remove historical fill. Some other typical actions for streams include, similar to fill removal, reconstructing streams where they used to exist, and bring their flow out of maybe what's probably now in a sewer pipe to the surface. So this is an example of a daylighting project that's in planning for Tibbetts Brook in the Bronx, and this is through the planned flow path right next to the Major Deegan. This is after a storm one November, where you can also clearly see that the site wants to be a wetland again, and hopefully one day soon it will be. Slightly less intensively, we can also help to rehabilitate and stabilize stream banks. So this is an example of a project in the Bronx River where we can place logs or stones to help bring the flow in towards the center of the channel, reduce the stress of high storm flows on the banks, but also provide low and high flow refuge for fish and other wildlife. So all of these recommendations really are kind of culminated in a map and a very robust data sheet and a database that has about, I think, 200 or 300 opportunities for restoration and management and protection activities throughout the city. These are, I would say this map, many of them are sitting kind of on top of each other. So all of the dots that you see on this map are only probably a smattering of the opportunities just based on the scale, but these are all boiled down in the framework to a few priority projects that we're able to kind of quantify the target size of the project and the target cost. Shifting back a little bit to the policy side, we also have critical recommendations for acquisition and transfer of these habitats where we need them, or of these locations where needed. So we're working to identify priority sites and where possible, seek some funding for acquisition. Many of these sites are also in a few locations like Sawmill Creek, for example, privately held properties in the middle of a wetland itself. And so they're often, because they're so regulated as it is, and also because they're often wetland themselves, they're not developable or couldn't provide any sort of commercial benefit, and often end up on tax lien sales lists, for example. So we're trying to work with other city agencies to help make sure those properties do not get sold and potentially risked for development again, and end up in part of the public trust. We also work with other city agencies to transfer city property to parks, prioritizing highest conservation area. So there are other areas that are just owned by other agencies for whatever reason. And we're always aiming to transfer parcels to parkland where possible. We're also working with partners at the Natural Areas Conservancy and other organizations to consider the role that private land conservation organizations can play in this process, where it's hard for the city occasionally to purchase the property outright. Often private land organizations can purchase and hold the property until it can be transferred. Additional policy recommendations include low impact design and climate resilience. So we'd like to work with other agencies to incentivize those where possible. So road raising projects hopefully should increase wildlife or hydraulic connectivity between resources. One example that we're working with New York City Economic Development Corporation for is the Travis Avenue road raising, where we actually will be installing a couple of eco culverts and hydro culverts to allow turtles, for example, diamondback terrapins, to pass over the roadway, where we do see a lot of roadside mortality. In addition, any road repaving projects or newer as of right development could include and should include more robust stormwater management strategies to maximize stormwater capture at the source versus in downstream or receiving wetlands. Outside of direct management, regulations need to also be improved to facilitate protection. The hundreds of small wetlands, vernal pools, and headwater streams that provide habitat to rare plants and salamanders remain unregulated and easily developed, particularly in private hands. But most critically, we have to know where these resources are to better protect them. The maps right now that kind of guide protection in New York State are 35 to 40 years old, and they don't reflect the current state of development or even how our climate has changed over the last decades. And finally, when development and repair of aging infrastructure requires mitigation, as it often does, we must work to ensure that mitigation projects are offsetting impacts within that watershed and meet or exceed targeted outcomes and are appropriately maintained. So just for all of these recommendations, it's critical that we have a broad base of resources needed to achieve all of our goals. So we need staffing for monitoring project success, but also to identify where the threats are most critical to help identify restoration sites. We need design and landscape architects and construction managers to be able to implement capital projects, and crews to do work on the ground to help care for them. We also need funding for the property acquisition and for capital projects. And most critically, we need a robust group of outreach specialists who can bolster community stewardship, build partnerships with local NGOs, and increase advocacy. And as I just mentioned, we need improved policies that reflect a changing climate and improve regulation, but we also need better coordination among intergovernmental agencies. And I'm sure there's more, but that's all for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Marit, for your overview of New York City's wetlands and your synthesis of what New York City Parks has done to protect, restore, and manage its wetlands. Now we have time for questions from the conference participants for the speakers. So please make sure to add your questions using the Q&A function if you've not done so already. We're also interested in dialogue among the presenters, so feel free to the presenters to direct your questions to each other. And actually, that's one of the questions I would start out with, which is this is such a wonderful overview. And from your different perspectives, and you've, both New York City Parks and Dr. Calhoun, you've been so successful in the work that you've done to build, to establish, to engage those who have an interest in addressing wetlands and restoration and protection. So my first question would be, like, what would you say to each other from the point of view of the researcher who's doing research on the science of wetlands, and from the point of view of those working for government agencies who've been so successful in implementing and enacting into policy effective measures for wetlands restoration, protection, and management. So that would be a first question to start it off, would be what advice you'd have for each other, or opportunities you see to work together to be even more successful, or how what you've done could be a model for other places.
Well, hearing no one, I'll start. That was very interesting to learn about your work in New York. And as you were talking, I was wondering what the sizes of an individual wetland were, maybe if you have an average or a range. And I was also interested in one of the questions posted, and relevant to talking about what we have in common with work, is how do you deal with the wetlands that are in the heart of the city versus the ones outlying. So I guess two questions: what's the size and acreage, so it helps me understand the size of functional ecosystems, and then their connections to some of the others.
I could take the size question. For freshwater wetlands, I think, smaller, certainly vernal pools, but also other systems that are maybe 0.1 acres up to, I think, 30, 35 or 40 or so, maybe larger, depending on how you define a wetland complex. And then for salt marshes, our smallest, I think our average, for freshwater is about 5 acres per wetland. And then for salt marshes, our smaller ones can be, just a very thin strip around a shoreline, but the ones that we really consider and make sure we care for, about an acre at the minimum, up to about 250.
Thank you.
And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Dealing with the, how are your goals different for the wetlands that are right in the heart of New York, the parks in New York City versus on the outskirts? And is there any, do you think about connectivity in that sense, or it's just not possible? And does your strategy vary when it's a completely surrounded small area?
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
question, Mark. Go ahead.
I'll take a stab and you can answer too, Becca. Our strategies definitely vary with respect to kind of what our targets are and our goals are, whether it's restoration and management. In the in small, seemingly disconnected sites, we might prioritize trying to establish a kind of a representative wetlands ecological vegetation community, for example. We might spend perhaps more effort on managing a Phragmites marsh, both because we want to sort of demonstrate that there can be a diverse set of other native plants there to experience and talk about. It also could be because those native plants are often a little bit shorter than Phrag, which can often be in the midst of an environment where sight lines are kind of helpful to make people feel safe. And they can also sometimes hide garbage and debris more readily than a native vegetation community that's really well cared for. So we might not necessarily be focusing on those things in a larger, more remote salt marsh complex, for example, or even freshwater complex, where we might be looking at opportunities to address bigger stormwater inputs, or in the case of salt marshes, assuring that we've got habitat that is going to support rare species that they're certainly not going to find in a little interior marsh. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that does. And I'm curious if you ever think of if there are opportunities to expanding some of those areas of concern into private lands adjacent, or maybe you don't have those.
I'm trying to think of an example in order to be able to answer the question well. I mean, I think we think of it a lot in theory. I think we've had some very well advertised and relatively recent failures to do that, where we weren't able to ensure that partnerships were developed with private property owners to preserve land. I think we've probably got some good examples where we've been more successful, certainly with adjacent, certainly over, I'd say, the arc of our work in New York. We've been able to do that in conjunction with opportunities we identified for transfer and acquisition through longtime partnership with the Harbor Estuary Program, where we focused on acquisition with the Trust for Public Land. I'm going to mention one other, I think, success that we've had, not with private property owners, but with other agencies whose mission is not to preserve and protect natural areas. And that is the Wetland Transfer Task Force that we had in the city beginning in 2005. And that helped us essentially partner with agencies where their mission might actually be to develop the property. And so by identifying wetlands that spilled over, if you will, or that were connected on other properties, we could provide protection.
Thanks.
A couple of questions here, mostly for the New York City parks, about you mentioned invasive species as one of the greatest, as a significant threat. Questions about Phragmites. What specific management? Everybody would have this question, I think. What specific management methods could be most successful in limiting the spread and proliferation of wetlands invasives like Phragmites? And another question about, let's see, it jumped off of my screen, but it was also about Phragmites and managing Phragmites.
Becca, you wanted to start?
Yeah, I can go. So it really depends on where the Phragmites is. And Like Bart also mentioned, if there are, concerns about public perception associated with it, and also why we believe it's persisting. So there's several things that we consider when deciding whether or not to tackle it or not. I will say there are certainly schools of thought, and we are not opposed to the school of thought that Phragmites does provide, certain functions, particularly in, water quality and such. And so in areas where we have, Phragmites encroaches along the shoreline, for example, one of the first things we're going to look at is what's the soil type underneath it. Is it sand, or is it something natural, or is it bricks and junk and hunks of concrete debris? And if it's chunks of concrete debris, we're not going to attempt to mow it. It'll become a restoration opportunity where we'll do fill removal to actually bring it out. There's no point in then lowering the elevation to where it's at an elevation to where it doesn't get flooded, or it gets flooded regularly and is less likely to persist. If it is in an area that it can be mowed and flooded, then we honestly might consider doing that. There's a couple of instances where we have mowed Phragmites with a decent amount of success. Parts of Staten Island on the East Shore, for example, where we are tasked with helping remove Phragmites for fire risk next to adjacent homes, for example. Repeat mowing has been fairly successful in really knocking it back, but it's because it's at the right roughly at the right elevation to where it does get flooded and doesn't bounce back so quickly. But where it's not going to be flooded, and it will help our marshes migrate sooner long term, if the soil is nice. So maybe it's something that we don't necessarily mow until we need to. There's also a significant capacity issue. Obviously, we're a small team and don't have the resources always to go out and do that cutting. It's pretty intensive. So those are some of the examples of considerations we make.
Very good, thank you. On the topic of restoration and back to vernal pools, there's a question here about, is it possible to recreate vernal pools artificially for restoration purposes? Dr. Calhoun, could you please speak a little bit to that question?
Sure. The answer is it's context dependent. In landscapes where vernal pools have essentially disappeared, in Ohio and the Midwest, it has been successful. We wrote sort of a review paper on this, and the problem is that if people think they're easy to create, then people don't conserve them. And the issue with recreating them is, as we've demonstrated in research, there's 95% fidelity from the frogs and salamanders for breeding in the same pools from which they hatch, which makes ecological sense because it's a successful pool. I have pictures from Rhode Island of wood frogs going back and laying their eggs on pavement where there once was a pool. And we also know there's some fidelity to hibernation sites. So and we also now know that there are microevolutionary processes going on, that local populations have adapted to local conditions, and it's microevolutionary because it's happening at a scale of generations rather than eons. So it should be a last resort. And one should try to restore first. One other problem that we find with creating vernal pools, especially next to pools that are already functioning, is it invites more bullfrogs and green frogs, which we have demonstrated with research carry chytrid and monovirus to vernal pools. Those animals are carriers, but they don't get sick themselves. So I say in last resort, landscapes where pools have been extirpated or are very few, it is a good tool. And there are manuals written on vernal pool creation that people should pay attention to, because if you get the hydrology wrong, you end up having bullfrog and green frog pools. So context is everything. And if you're going to create pools, make sure you get the relevant literature on how to do it.
Very good, thank you. And context also playing into your comments on connectivity with the forest. And I assume there's a strong element of the health of the adjacent forest and success a potential to restore vernal pools. Okay, so I think a couple of questions about, of course, close to our hearts, about volunteers, how volunteers can get involved, and also about the role that iNaturalist can play or has played or does play in decisions made. So for example, New York City Parks. Does New York City Parks, have you mentioned iNaturalist and how helpful it's been. Could you elaborate a little more on the information that could come from iNaturalist and how or whether it's used in informing policy?
Sure. So one of the ways we've used it, I think it's actually with rare plant monitoring, more or less. There's a few instances where I think we've learned of a new location of a plant or been able to relocate a plant that we had records of, but had not been able to relocate in the field. We're able to find it from iNaturalist. In some of those instances, we actually do monitor some of those populations, but in many instances too, it's directed us to locations where we've been able to erect protective fencing for deer management.
Actually, there is a question in here about deer management. Could you say a little bit more about that in New York City Parks?
Sure. Deer management is absolutely critical for our forest restoration efforts in particular, and Staten Island and increasingly in the Bronx. We really can't in some places move ahead with a restoration planting in particular without having at the same time fenced off an area or at the very least installed deer guards around our trees. So it's a very knotty and tricky issue, as I'm sure everyone knows, and we've seen the transformation of our forests over the last decades with the increasing population. So we know that if we fence off sites, rare plants will do better and propagate. Where we don't fence off, we'll lose them entirely in some demonstrated cases we have, and that our forest replantings will really depend on that kind of fencing and protection. I just want to go back to the stewardship question as well. I think we're increasingly incorporating different tools when we do our outreach, and we're actually on the ground working with stewards in the field. So we use iNaturalist ourselves, and we show, especially if someone like me who's a little bit plant challenged, it's really critical, and we share that with our stewards that come out. We have increasing number of events that we try to do in wetlands. It's always a little bit a balance between making sure that we are not trampling a site, not bringing too many people out to a site, also balancing the right kind of difficulty, whether it's a risk actually of getting stuck in the mud, or being into at a site that has some other danger, and making sure that the volunteers that are participating have a good experience and want to come back. But we're more and more focused on trying to do that, and we do get thousands and thousands of volunteers every year out to our sites, and other partners do as well. One of our partners who are really effective in doing things like shoreline cleanups are participate in all that and getting increased access and visibility in our wetlands.
Very good, thank you. Your colleague Clara Holmes also pointed out on the use of iNaturalist, which has been also helpful to track the early detection and rapid response for new and emerging invasive species. Another way in which community science and iNaturalist have been very helpful. So great comment there. Lots of comments here about how wonderful these presentations were and how there's just so much information here that serves as a great model for how to work together with community science and how to engage agencies and get policy, and implement policy. So congratulations to all of you and thank you for your contributions here. There's a question about, this is a little bit afield, but of course, coming from the New York Botanical Garden, it's not an unreasonable question, but about how those of us in public gardens and horticulture can support these initiatives that you've all been working on. I suspect New York City Parks has something to say about this. Are there similar initiatives, research that you're aware of, that those of us asking about somebody in the Mid-Atlantic, that in similar initiatives that public parks and horticulturists could support or participate in? Any comments on that?
Well, I'll jump in and just say in general, we have a horticulture program that's very small within our group under our division of forestry, horticulture, and natural resources, but obviously we have a lot of gardeners and horticulture going on in our park system. And we are increasingly trying to promote the use of native plants and diverse species of local ecotypes that are appropriate for our environments, and that also have we're also forward thinking and looking at how those community types can support pollinators and provide ecosystem benefits on a small scale. So that's one of the big efforts of our horticulture director in our division, collaborating in both within our parks department and with partners. So we often field questions both, as I said, from our horticulture team as well as at our native plant center about regarding what species work well in community gardens, so we provide plant lists and guides. Again, mentioning Clara Holmes, she's worked on our update every 3 or 4 years for our native plant guide. So those are really important tools that we'd love to get the word out about. And I think that's perhaps, and then getting those gardeners and those community horticulturalists to participate in the workshops that we've held, where really hundreds of people have attended, and there's been a lot of interest in continuing to work in those networks, and then being vocal when you see some of the legislature, for example, that might come through the New York City Council that maybe isn't as favorable. And there's been really positive legislature in the past years. Becca, you want to comment at all about that, Stu?
No, I think that's great. And then Georgina also just mentioned that there are, also opportunities to volunteer. But for those who are interested in volunteering outside of specific events, we have a super steward program as well, where you're undergo training for advanced volunteer mentorship.
And in fact, we have opportunities for volunteering through both that program, thanks Georgina, our super stewards, and at our native plant center. And we have nurseries focusing on native plants, both on Staten Island and in the Bronx, so both ends of the city.
Good, thank you. And thank for the link, Georgina. I've posted that again down at the bottom of the chat. Great resource to have there, information on on how to volunteer with New York City Parks. We have a question here about the impact of the pandemic on wetlands. And Dr. Calhoun, you addressed this very specifically in terms of roadkill deaths to salamanders. Wondering if any of the three of you would expand any more on information about what happened during the pandemic that impacted the well-being of wetlands.
Well, from my perspective, for 2 years, we haven't been able to meet in person, and municipalities' time and energy went from wetland conservation to dealing with keeping their citizens safe and getting people medical outlets, and it was sort of devastating in terms of our community work. It brought it to a screeching halt, and we're just now getting people engaged again, moving forward, but still people are not comfortable meeting inside here. So I bet that a lot of conservation get-togethers and so forth halted, but the upside of that is that there weren't many people out, and a lot of things got a chance to recover a bit. But now I just heard on NPR that a lot of the progress that we made from being absent is being overrun again. It doesn't take long to see the effects of people coming back to life. So that's the biggest way that it's affected my work, and it probably everybody's.
Agreed. That's certainly been noticeable for us too. I would just say that in New York, there's been much more intense use of parks, of course, during the pandemic. That's where people needed to meet and hang out, and that has pushed its way into all of our parklands and natural areas as well. I don't know that we have measured that. We already knew through work with the Natural Areas Conservancy that parks and natural areas were sometimes the main way in which New Yorkers experienced nature at all, because they weren't many New Yorkers don't have second homes in the country and don't get to travel to national parks, but they do visit, fish, kayak, wade, swim in our coastal waters in particular. So I think we probably have more intense use of parks, certainly in dense areas that had, and then there are accompanying wetlands and associated garbage and debris. I think were challenges. So there's the good and the bad. I think more visibility and awareness, but not necessarily enough care and stewardship. We also had to pull back our efforts in stewardship, certainly during the pandemic. And I would say on the regulatory end, our colleagues at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation became very strapped in. They were pulled off to a lot of pandemic-related work, and I think that there was probably some negative effect of that, not being able to do enforcement and regulation in the way that we would like from our partners there.
Very good, thank you. Still lots of good questions coming in. Before we wrap it up, we just have a few more minutes. Quick question about resources. This would be more for Dr. Calhoun, I think, but I think any three of you may have insights on this. Resources for property owners with some acreage and mixed environments with some invasive species, but some healthy native environments. For example, if vernal pools are in the equation, thoughts for those who would be attempting to renovate or restore their land or protect. Any advice on that?
Yes. So if you go to the webpage, Michael Clements from Connecticut and also working in New York, and I put together something called, I don't remember the name, Best Development Practices for Vernal Pools, which has some guidance for landowners. And we recently updated some of that advice on my website on, I think it's under what you can do for landowners, both for those with small amounts of forest land associated with their home and those that don't have more than 10 acres to deal with. So we put some management guidelines out there, and there's really a need and a call for all of us to find out who the service providers are for the homeowner. Who is it that, for in urban areas, I would think, or suburban areas, getting in touch with the people who do the lawn care, for example. We need to reach out to the people who interact with the homeowner to help them do more nature-friendly practices. And so my group has published all these manuals and work on vernal pool management and what you do with a landowner. But if they don't have it, then they're not going to use it. They're not going to go to the webpage. So the way that we're doing that now is trying to reach out more to the service providers for the landowner, the local forestry people, the local landscape people, whoever comes into their lives that they trust. So that's my advice.
Very good. Thank you. Specific question for the New York City folks. Have rain gardens been effective in stormwater control?
I guess the short answer is yes. It's a complicated answer because it's actually much of the rain garden and green infrastructure program, as you probably know, is managed by New York City DEP, and they are under consent order to meet certain milestones in order to achieve what they're committed to for water quality improvement under long-term control plans regulated by the state. So they are, on track to do that with the numbers of rain gardens that they are, rolling out, and each of those are designed to capture a certain amount of water, so that's tracked, and will be increasing, and that's done also in park systems. We do it in our capital projects, and we are under this unified stormwater rule that requires capturing stormwater and treating it in not just our combined sewer overflow watersheds, but also in our separate municipal storm and sewer watersheds to do that. So the short answer is yes, but there's a lot in there.
Very good. Thank you. All right, we just have a couple minutes to wrap up. I would actually finish by going a little bit off script. And I would say that, the three of you have given such wonderful presentations here, and there's so much here for us to love about, especially coming from the New York Botanical Garden, where we're really, conservation, community engagement, policy, science, it all really comes together. And the three of you have put it together in such wonderful ways. And I would actually just ask each of you in turn, starting with Aram, and then Merritt and Rebecca, to quickly say something about and I know we have young people in the audience. We have students, we have our younger staff who work at the Botanical Garden, and people we know in the community. Could you say a little bit quickly about your career path and how you came to do what you do, and something that could be helpful to young people who might be interested in making a difference in the way that you all have made a difference and done such wonderful work? Can we start with Aram?
Wow, that was a lot to throw out there. I guess I grew up in a rural environment and was apparently my house was on an Atlantic white cedar swamp. So I grew up with all the animals that I'm now trying to shepherd through life. So I was very tied to wetlands. My career path was very circuitous. I got an undergraduate degree in literature and political science. So it's just that, and then I was teaching for a while, and it came that I was teaching everything through ecology. So I finally decided, you know what, you're very interested in ecology, and wanted to be able to do something to give back to the environment that provides my ability to go forward. I have to be in the woods. I live in the middle of 11,000 acres. So, that's just what spoke to me. And so that's how I got to this career where I was doing the best I can to try to conserve these places and speak for the things that can't speak for themselves. So for young people, I mean, obviously I taught college for a long time. For the young people, I just say, be very patient, be very open-minded, and choose a profession that gets you really excited, because you need a lot of patience, and there's a lot of setbacks. So if you're passionate about what you're doing, it gives you the energy to go on. So find that place, take time to find that place, be open to new experiences. You will find that place, but it might take years and years.
Thank you, Aram. I don't think I, in some ways, have much to add. I mean, I had always known from basically grade school that I wanted to work in the environment and protection in some big way. It took me, decades to figure out whether that was more policy or social science or more science. And in some ways, I took a circuitous route. I feel in my own mind, in that I decided only in graduate school that I wanted to get a strong science foundation. But now, decades later, I'm kind of working in resource management, and sadly don't use my certainly don't use differential equations on a daily basis or even decadal basis. But I'd second RM's recommendation to be patient and really to feel things out. What gives you the greatest satisfaction? Keep your long-term vision in mind. And I would just say, talk to a lot of people and try to get a lot of different experiences. Get out there and volunteer. Try things out because you have time. And I'll hand it to Becca, the youngest of us.
Yeah, I'm afraid my guidance is also probably similar. I grew up in Dallas and knew I liked science and history. Those were my two favorite subjects, kind of with a focus on plants and rocks and chemicals. Those were the things that I liked. Somehow ended up with a biology degree. I'm not really sure exactly how that all fit together. But I knew I would be happy doing a wide variety of things outside. That was the critical piece. I really knew I wanted to be outside. When I finished school in the Great Recession and entered into a really awful job market. And so my advice is coming from that perspective, but it's always to say yes to new opportunities that sound interested to you, and say yes a lot. And then the older you get, learn to more aggressively say no.
I'll take that advice. Thank you very much. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. That's really nice and great advice. So let's wrap it up. Huge thanks to the speakers, to the audience participants, to also our quiet behind the scenes presence here from Lydia Paradiso, our graduate student who's been helping to manage behind the scenes. Thank you all for your wonderful contributions to this conference today. Please see the links in the chat for more information about the Ecoflora project and more information about some of the topics we discussed, like how to volunteer. And goodbye for now. We hope to see you for the 5th annual Ecoflora conference next year. Signing off.